1988. John Carpenter's political horror middle finger to former President Reagan film. Does it deserve to be called a horror classic? Hey y'all, it's your Twisted Girl next door here, and this is my Overhyped or Right segment where I review and dissect popular and cult horror classics to see if the hype they get is justified. Today I'm reviewing They Live, the 1988 horror political movie that deals with an outer world drifter who finds out through these sunglasses, that the wealthy elite are actually aliens who are using subliminal messaging and mass media to keep the working class poor and in poverty and accepting of the status quo. Good times. My point of reference, aka have I seen this film before? Yes, I have seen this film one time before years ago, and I watched it very recently to do this review. So let's get into the guts of They Live. First point is the plot. Was the plot innovative and or groundbreaking? Yes. Yes. Okay, so y'all know, if you've seen any of my previous videos, I love my political horror, especially when it's done right, especially when there's deeper themes, because I always believe that horror is a great genre and does have a history of being a great genre that can put a mirror basically to society and use supernatural and horror ways to reflect real world issues. And I think what They Live did was that it was so on the nose, so direct in addressing, especially in the context of the time that this movie came out, which I'll get to in a second, the real inequalities in society, taking on the wealthy elite, not just like this scary entity who knows where they're from, but saying, no, this is the wealthy elite, and maybe they are aliens in some sort if they're able to get this much power and control people in such a way and keep them exploited and in poverty. And I just think that is such a bold kind of plot to have, especially in this world, in this capitalist world we live in. And so cool that, to kind of do it in a way that's still science fiction and horror and still has those elements in a very cool way, but also a very political way. So yes, this film's plot was definitely innovative and, in my opinion, groundbreaking. Second point is the characters. Were any of the characters in the film iconic and or really memorable? Yes. There were already some very interesting characters. This movie had one character in particular that really stood out, which was John Nada. In the film, he doesn't have any, name until the post credits. And, but he's basically the drifter in the film, played by, the former wrestler, may he rest in peace. And I just think there was something so effective about this character. He's a working class, blue collar kind of guy, because sometimes in these films you have like a scientist or a trained military guy or something like that who already is so well versed in how to handle, for whatever reason, how would you know, an alien invasion and stuff like that. To have it so that this is a working class guy who just yesterday was working on a construction site, digging ditches, which is important work, but doing manual labor, and then turning around and trying to thwart this plot of these aliens who are trying to take over the world. John Nada was awesome. Third, dialogue/script. Was the dialogue or the script, were there any memorable lines or scenes or speeches that just, will hold up the test of time, that people will quote, reference for the rest of their days in popular culture? Yes. There were definitely some iconic. Some weren't even said out loud. From the aliens, which was obey, marry, reproduce, multiply. No independent thought, no individual imagination, things of that nature that were in the billboards that were so relevant. You've probably seen an Obey shirt somewhere in some kind of Hot Topic store or something in your lifetime if you've ever shopped in a mall. And this stuff, if you didn't know, it actually comes from this film, right? The whole thing of obey, no imagination, things of that nature. That's from They Live. It's iconic because, and I don't think it's just because, it's catchy, because that's not catchy. Obey is not catchy. What it is, it's in reference to what this film is talking on. And when you can have dialogue that plays into that in such a way, I think, that still works for today, where people can wear shirts and it's not just like, oh, they live, but oh, yeah, definitely. That is iconic dialogue. And also the famous line when he goes into the bank of, I came to chew bubble gum and kick ass, and I'm all out of bubble gum. That's pretty much a famous line, and rightly so. The fourth factor, and probably, has to be a pretty big factor, given that this is a horror classic, is it scary? Okay, so in that case, I'm going to say it's 50-50, because I'm going to say that's conditional for this film. It is conditional on whether or not you think this is a scary movie, because of the fact that, one, everything happens in the daylight. There's really no night scenes, except one major scene is in the nighttime. But the thing is, it's not so much that this movie has a lot of jump scares. Like, there's no point in this movie where you're like, oh, you know what I mean? Like, when, just like that, oh, when you watch a film. There's no point like that in the film, in my opinion. But I think sometimes horror pictures are frightening because of the topic that they dive into and how close to home that can be. And I think in that case, if you dig that sort of thing, like we've already been talking about with the plot line of this film, the themes in this film, then yes, that is scary, right? The idea that there's this class of people who are basically working to keep another class of people as basically wage labor slaves, which isn't too far off from reality. Yeah. But in this case, they're supernatural aliens. But I think that's scary in and of itself. But in terms of jump scares, in terms of I'm going to have to check my closet and under my bed before I go to bed, no, this is not scary in that sense. Another thing I like to look at when dissecting movies is the context in which the movie was made. Like, what was the era in which this movie came out? Because that's going to determine whether or not it was groundbreaking, whether there were people doing this sort of thing, or if it was addressing something that was relevant during that time or not. And in this case, like I mentioned earlier, this movie happened during the Reagan era, right? This controversial presidency, depending on which side of the political aisle you ended up on, who, has a legacy in our 2018 world of being anti-labor, even though he belonged to the actors union, being a president that basically targeted certain communities of people, and also his whole trickle-down economy theory, which, spoiler alert, for life, that doesn't work. Trickle-down economy, no. That's not a thing. Look it up. So that was a big thing. And so you had this time where there was this growing wage gap that was going on and people in poverty during this time. And then Carpenter's film comes out. And, the film is also, addressing consumerism, this whole idea of just buying, giving your money back, your hard-earned money back to business people, and therefore never being able to accumulate any sort of wealth. And I think when you look at the context of how controversial this era of time was, how hard it was for people who belong to unions, to the labor struggle, then I think it's really innovative that this film was done in that time. And like Carpenter says and has said in certain interviews since that time, because I did my research, y'all, this was a middle finger to Reagan. And no matter how you feel about Reagan, I think there's some legitimacy to that, at least in terms of being groundbreaking, at least in terms of him going against the grain and creating this kind of film. And then there are my cons. I got two major cons with this film. One that I think people are going to want to rip me to shreds for, saying that it's a con. The first major con, which isn't really a major con compared to my second con, is that alleyway scene. Okay? Now I know for whatever reason that's gone into so many film books and things of that nature, saying it's one of the best fights ever in the history of filmmaking. Okay, that might be so, but let's talk about it in relation to the narrative. That fight scene was about 6 minutes long, right? It was like 6, maybe 10 minutes. It felt like 10 minutes to me, but I read that it's 6 minutes long. That means it was 5 minutes too long, okay? It was a 6-minute alleyway, drop down fight between the two major characters, and it was 6 minutes. 6 minutes. I checked my phone during that moment, which really sucked because I was enjoying the film. And then 6 minutes of them brawling in the alleyway happened. And I'm like, why is this 6 minutes? And I know I know there's a lot of people like, that was the best thing because the actor was a wrestler in real life and blah, blah. Okay, fine. And it did look really cool, I guess. I mean, it looked real. I mean, it was brutal. The thing is, was it necessary for this film? Or was it some sort of fan service because of what the actor did in another profession? And then my second major con, and this is the major con that I had with it, is that I think there was a missed opportunity in not having it so that there was any major woman character on the side of the human rebellion. And the reason why I say this, and this is not me saying, I'm not one of those people who think you need to have a strong woman character in every single film, or you need to have this kind of diversity in every single film. I'm not that person. What I'm saying is when it makes sense for the narrative to help the story, then it's a missed opportunity if it wasn't there. And you may be saying, oh, this was like the 1980s, it's not the same as now where that's on top of everyone's mind. First of all, we're still having issues with strong women characters being in films, even in 2018. But secondly, actually, in the 1980s, it would have made complete sense for there to be a woman, particularly a woman of color, even more specific, a black woman on the side of the rebellion as a lead character, because of the fact this being a movie that was so against what Reagan was pulling when it came to the economy. And one of his major things, fun fact of history, was his campaign against the so-called welfare queen, the welfare queen. And what the welfare queen was this fictitious being he had created that's saying that there was a crisis of women, particularly black women, who were committing welfare fraud. Now, we all know, if you look at history since then, that was not the case. But he specifically targeted that demographic. And I'm thinking, if that's what was happening during that time, how cool would it have been to have, and particularly a black woman kind of on the side of the rebellion, basically another middle finger to being targeted and being made to fit some type of stereotype of, the lazy black woman or whatever, that wasn't actually the case. So I think in the terms of the context of the history of what he was getting at, it was a missed opportunity. Also, another fun fact, since the 1970s, women have been in poverty at a higher rate than men. And that's still the case today, which means in 1988, it would have made a lot of sense that there were a lot of women who were also part of this human rebellion, because there were a lot of women, more so than men, even now today, in poverty. Okay, so with all of that said, is They Live overhyped, or are the people who love it, and the fact that it is part of mainstream culture of what we know as horror classics, right? This movie, the hype is justified. Totally justified. Yes, there's a few shortcomings here and there. Yes, it's not necessarily one of those films where you're going to jump out of your seat because of a scene, but it definitely is an evergreen kind of film. It's definitely the kind of film that I think people should watch, even now in 2018, definitely now in this time that we live in when it comes to poverty and the wage gap and inequalities. It's relevant, and it did its duty in putting that messaging out in such an awesome, horror-filled way. So, what did you think of They Live? Do you think I'm completely right? Do you want to rip me to shreds because I hated that alleyway scene? Comment down below. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know what you think. And also, be sure to subscribe so that you are the first to know when I post my videos of all things horror. Thanks for watching. Let's get creepy together.